So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the Sunshine Law. Florida Sunshine Law is governed under Chapter 286 of the Florida statutes. Now, if anyone has a question about the Sunshine Law, obviously you can reach out to us. But just so you know, that would not be the Florida Commission on Ethics. That would be the Attorney General. So if you have a question, you can always reach out to the Attorney General, and they can either talk to you on the phone or give you an opinion. A lot of boards don't realize that they can contact these folks directly, but as a board member, you can. So Sunshine, Florida has a unique governmental system in that we believe in doing business in the sunshine, in the light of day, with transparency for the public. And this is sort of a core tenet of Florida government life, and it's across all organizations, including ELCs. It is different. So if you come from another state, it can be very different and very difficult to wrap your head around. The goal of this is to ensure public access. So because the money that we spend is taxpayer money, we want the public to be aware of our decisions, of the way we're spending our money, of the way we're governing, of the way we're making decisions, because ultimately these are public funds that we're spending. It is also memorialized in the Florida Constitution in Article 1, Section 24, which states that all meetings of any public body of the executive branch shall be open and noticed to the public. So Sunshine requires, we'll go to the next slide. It requires open access to government meetings so that the public has an awareness of the officials' actions within the scope of their duties. There's a case if you all want to dig into it a little bit more, but basically says public meetings have to be open. So we'll go to the next slide. So these are the requirements for public meetings. These are all outlined in Florida Statutes, Chapter 286, Spot 011. So meetings must be open to the public and reasonable notice must be provided. Now, the statute doesn't say it has to be 24 hours, it has to be 48 hours, it has to be 1 week. It gives latitude, and there's a lot of case law that talks about what is the best practice and what is allowed and what is legal. A general rule of thumb is you want to give a week. In an emergency, you can give 72 hours. In a real emergency, you can give less. A real emergency is usually a hurricane. So other than a hurricane, typically you want to give 72 hours. A week is obviously better for standard meetings. You can give shorter notice, but the notice requirement, there's not, so sometimes people in the public will say, well, you didn't give me a week notice. You didn't give me 30 days notice. We don't have to. No binding actions can be taken unless they're in a public meeting. And decisions, this is important, they include discussions, deliberations, and recommendations that are all part of the official action, not just the vote. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit more about notice. So the Attorney General has some guidelines, because again, this isn't in the law, so there's guidelines and case law to provide guidance for this. The notice of the meeting should include time, place, and agenda summary. So time, place, and topic. Doesn't have to include, all the content of the agenda, but the topics that will be discussed. 24-hour notice is sufficient for emergencies. Now, something I like to flag to clients is if you have a spot on your agenda that says additions, deletions, deferrals, or additions or deletions, that is notice to the public that you might add something to the meeting. So sometimes a board member will make a motion and say, I want to discuss this today, even though it's on the meeting. If you have given the public notice that you're going to have the meeting and that other topics could be added, that constitutes sufficient notice. All right, let's keep going. So the location of meetings is important. The goal of this is, again, all about government in the sunshine. We don't want to chill free speech and we don't want to chill public participation. So meetings should be held in public accessible locations. We should not hold meetings in restaurants, small rooms like tiny offices, or locations that do not have full access. So locations with discriminatory access. So you want to make sure you're not holding them in an like here's a good example. It's an office building and you're holding them in one small office of one executive. And the only way to get there is to take an elevator, but the elevator's out. So you have to take the stairs and you have to go through a security guard. That would likely be considered discriminatory access. The meetings of the ELCs are generally fine. And again, in an emergency, if you had to, let's say you had to relocate out of the office and have a meeting, You could do that, but I would recommend you do it in a public place like a library. That's a good example, or another government building, county building, city building, park building. Okay, let's talk about meeting minutes. So Florida does not require that meetings be recorded. Some people think that it does require that. It does not. Minutes must be recorded and made available for public inspection. Written minutes are required. Recording is optional. It can support the written record. We are not required to record meetings. We are not required to broadcast meetings. We are required to keep written minutes. And minutes are not an exact transcription of the meeting. They are minutes as taken by the secretary, which tends to be a summary of the discussion and the actions that are taken. All right, let's talk a little bit more about public participation. Let's go to the next slide. So at the meetings, the public must have a reasonable chance to be heard, either at the same meeting or another within a reasonable time. Participation does not need to be at the decision-making meeting, but must occur before final action. Here's a good example. A lot of ELCs don't do this, but some do for some bigger decisions. Some organizations or ELCs will have a workshop where no vote is taken to discuss a complex item. Let's say, for example, you want to move to a different space and it's going to be expensive and it's going to take time and you're going to have to break your lease and there's going to be costs. So you might have a workshop, like a 2-hour long workshop to discuss it. At the workshop, you're not going to take a vote. You can allow public participation or you cannot. And then you have another meeting, maybe a day later, maybe a week later, where you are going to vote. Now, you've already had your discussion at a public meeting. You have to give the public an opportunity to speak on that item, either at the workshop or at the final meeting. You don't have to do both, but they do have to have an opportunity to make their feelings known before a vote is taken. All right, let's keep going. More on this, the public does have a right to hear the comments made by the board, which is why the workshops or other discussions have to be open in public. And to that end, we would urge you, and the law requires that you avoid side conversations, private notes, sidebars, or messages during meetings. We're going to talk a little bit later about public records, but if you do that, if you take notes, even if they're not given to someone else during a public meeting, if you write a message and pass it to another board member, that is a public record. It does not matter that it is a draft. It does not matter that it is handwritten. It does not matter that it is not a final. If you've taken notes, they can be subject to public record. The public can request them and read them. So I always urge board members, be very careful what you write. So all of you have regular jobs, you have other things going on in your life, you have, professionals. You don't want to be in a board meeting sitting next to a friend who you've made friends with during your time on the board, and you guys are talking about something and you think the topic is silly, and on your agenda you write something like terrible that says this guy is an idiot, whatever. That guy who's maybe trying to sell something to the ELC, he's there for a bid, he sees you write a note, he makes a public records request, that public record request comes out, and now he's emailing it, he's trying to put on social media that you wrote on your agenda, this guy's an idiot. I would strongly urge you not to make any note that does not convey something you would not want to see on the front page of the paper or splashed all over Facebook. Time limits on public comments are permitted. They should not limit meaningful participation. Most places have 2 to 3 minutes. 1 minute is sufficient. 4 minutes is not common, but some places do it. But you do need to give them an opportunity to speak. You don't have to give them unlimited time, though. All right, let's keep on going. I will say one thing about time. It should be evenly applied. So if you're going to give everybody 3 minutes, give everybody 3 minutes. Don't be like, this guy's a jerk, he only gets 1 minute. So it needs to be even-handed. Who does this apply to? This applies to you all. That's what's most germane. But it does apply to all public officials, including board members. All right, let's keep talking about, on next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about ethics. Florida has a lot of rules under the Code of Ethics. The state offers a 4-hour training. I urge you all to do it. It is excellent. It is very detailed. And you can always ask questions, obviously, of me, of the staff, and the Florida Commission on Ethics. It's governed under Chapter 112 of the Florida statute. Largely, there's some other sections that are in other parts of the statute, but generally that's what governs ethics in Florida. The Sunshine Amendment, which is in our Florida Constitution, Article 2, Section 8, also contains standards of ethical conduct and disclosures that are applicable to public officers and employees. All right, so let's keep going and talk a little bit more about ethics to our next slide. So the Florida ethics laws do apply to board members such as yourselves, public officers, and employees. The goal is to prevent conflicts of interest and maintain public trust, and they are enforced by the Florida Commission on Ethics. Let's keep going. So let's talk a little bit about prohibited conduct for board members. So you need to avoid these actions. You cannot accept a gift over $100 from a lobbyist or a vendor. That's $100 a year. And that would either be however the ELC does their year. So if their year is January to December, that's their year. If their year is October to September 30th, that's their year. If their year is June to July, that's their year. So I'm sorry, June to May, that's their year. You have to not accept more than $100 a year. You cannot use your position for personal gain. I'm going to tell you how I've seen this happen and how you should be careful. You are a board member of an ELC. Not everyone's going to understand what that means. However, if you have a child, let's say in a VPK or daycare, they will know what that means. Or even if they go to regular public school, they'll know what that means. And you are upset because something has happened to your child. And you go to the school and you go to the principal and you demand a meeting. And as part of that demand, you say, I am a board member of the ELC and you do not know how much power I have, or whatever it is you're going to say, but you're using your influence as a board member for personal gain. That's when I see it happen the most. I've seen it happen where people do it on behalf of others. They do it on behalf, let's say it's someone doing it on behalf of their grandchild. Or sometimes on their neighbor, they'll go and they'll say, I'm a board member. You take VPK money. You have to listen to me. You cannot do that. It is deadly serious. Please do not do that. You cannot accept payments for influencing your decisions. Obviously, ELCs spend money. They spend public money. And so it's important that you do not accept any money in order to make a decision, particularly on an RFP or on a vote for a vendor. You also cannot disclose non-public information for personal benefit. A good example of this usually has to do with lobbying with respect for an RFP. So let's say, for example, go back to this thing about leasing space. You all want to move. You put out an RFP. We're looking for space. We need this much square feet. And we give a range. We say, okay, we're willing to pay between $12 and $30 a square foot. But you're a board member and you know how much they really want to spend. You cannot share that information if it's not public information with a potential landlord. Even if you're not getting any money, getting favor would be sufficient in that circumstance. All right, let's go to our next slide. Let's talk about conflict of interest in voting rules. So there are voting conflicts for board members. Board members do have to abstain from voting on matters that benefit themselves, their relatives, business associates, or employers' clients. And you must disclose the conflict before discussion. This is an area that clients have the most questions about, that there's the most trouble with, and it is the most complicated. We have a client right now whose husband has lobbied the board she's on right now, but lobbied before she joined the board. And we had to get a written opinion from ethics because other board members said, well, it's a conflict. She shouldn't vote at all. Other board members said she shouldn't be on the board. Other people said he can't come before the board. So we had to get an opinion. Basically, the opinion was she can be on the board. She can vote as long as he no longer brings any items to the board. If it's done in the past and the payment has been complete, we're good to go. But if he brings an item, not only can she not vote, she can't be on the board, because even if she recuses herself from the vote, the Ethics Commission found that her level of influence as a board member, even if she doesn't vote, would extend to the other board members and staff. And so she would not even be eligible to be on the board anymore. So it's wildly specific to people's circumstances, which is why we always urge you to reach out to us or reach out to the Florida Commission on Ethics. And again, if you work for a company or you have a spouse or a relative who does business with someone who's going to do business with an ELC, they're going to sell office supplies, they're going to provide lease office space, whatever it is, that's something you want to get ahead of. Also, if you're going to recuse yourself from a vote, you have to disclose it before the discussion on the item. So say, for example, you work for a realtor and you know that realtor is bidding on the ELC's the ELC is looking for new space, and you know they've put in a proposal. You know you're not going to vote. You can't just leave during the vote. You can't just quietly leave, go to the restroom. You have to, before the discussion starts, say, I am not going to participate in this discussion. My employer has put in a bid. I'm not involved in the bid. However, I am not going to vote. I'm not going to participate. You then cannot vote, but you need to disclose it before the discussion is held. Again, you don't want to have the discussion and be a part of it, even if you don't vote, because that's a conflict as well. All right, let's keep going. Financial disclosures and compliance. There's limited financial disclosures that are required for board members. Certainly work with staff to make sure that you do the required forms. You do have to report certain gifts and reimbursements. This is serious. If you have questions about this, please reach out to staff, or you can reach out to me or the Commission on Ethics. But, there can be fines. They can be removal from office and public censure. Removal from office, public censure isn't a huge deal. It can be embarrassing, but the fines are serious. All right, so let's go to some additional ethics rules that apply to board members. So board members cannot accept public employment if it was offered to influence their action. So you can't take a job if someone gave you that job to get you to vote a certain way at the board. You cannot represent others for compensation before they're on board. So you cannot lobby the board. You cannot be a realtor for a transaction before the board. You cannot advocate for hiring or promoting relatives within their agency. If you have a relative who applies, and then this happens, this is not, it's not bad. You have a niece, you have a cousin, you have a child who applies. You should disclose it to staff and say, just so you know, this is my child. I'm not going to be involved at all in this. And if there's any discussions, you should not be involved. You should recuse yourself. You cannot say, this is my child. He's great. You can just say, this is my child and he's applied for a job. I'm not going to involve myself in any discussions about my child. Just wanted to let you know. Out. That's also something you can always reach out to me about if you have a specific question. But it's not a bad thing. Those are things that can be easily solved, but always good to get ahead of it. All right, let's keep talking. Let's go to the next slide about ethics, complaint, and enforcement. Complaints.
Jim, I have a question about relatives real quick.
Sure.
So, in my previous life, I had a board member whose wife applied for a position, and we thought it was in best interest that, and we hired her, that he resigned from the board, which he did.
So candidly,
is that recommended? I mean,
it probably would have been fine if he stayed on the board. However, that would be when you call the Florida Commission on Ethics. I mean, you would want him to not vote on anything related to her. So if she was an executive and the board voted on her compensation, you'd want him to recuse himself. I will tell you, we have ELCs that are desperate for board members, and it's very hard for them to keep and retain good board members. And they're in a very small community. So, but honestly, the Florida Commission on Ethics will usually give an opinion. It's not. It happens. It happens with a high degree of frequency, particularly in small communities. Like think about cities. You'll have a city commissioner whose spouse works for the city. It's okay, almost always. You just have to be careful. They have to recuse themselves. And it's always best to talk to the Florida Commission on Ethics. Honestly, you probably would have been fine as long as he was careful with his votes and those votes didn't affect her employment in any way. But the state is aware that we have many small communities that can't source. There's just not enough humans. So it's there. You probably would have been okay, but in an abundance of caution, that's okay. But honestly, that's why the Florida Commission on Ethics exists, for like that exact scenario, and you'd lay it out to them and let them give you an opinion.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so complaints and enforcement. Anyone can make a complaint with the Florida Commission on Ethics. They are confidential until probable cause is found. Most complaints you find either are from boring board members, people who don't get along, the public, if someone is very mad, or a vendor who's very mad, who feels like they should have gotten a contract, they didn't, there was an ethical violation, and they raise a complaint. Did someone have a question about this? Okay. If probable cause is found, the case may proceed to a public hearing and result in disciplinary action. It can result in fines, public reprimands, or lobbying bans. The complaints are serious. If there's not probable cause, you might never even know someone raised a complaint against you. Sometimes you find out, sometimes you don't. Sometimes the lawyers find out. So I talk to them a lot. And sometimes they'll say, hey, just want to give you a heads up. You got 3 complaints against your board members. I don't think there's anything here. Just wanted to let you know it's coming. Or it's probably not coming, but just so you know, people are sharpening their knives for them. But if there's not probable cause, you might never know unless someone finds out, and you find out that way. If that happens, that's the time to call the lawyer. So if that happens, you call me, or you ask the staff, and you guys call me together, because it's serious. It can impact your livelihood. It can impact your pocket, and we would want to make sure that everyone, the ELC and you all, are protected, and we would figure that out at the time. Hopefully that never happens, but that's when you call the lawyer. You don't wait. You don't wait again. All right, let's keep going. Electronic communications. And I will just say that in the last 3 months since the election, I have had 10 times as many complaints to ethics than I had previously. There's a lot of intransigent and entrenched politics, and people are lobbying complaints against each other all the time. Most of them have gone nowhere, but we want to treat them seriously and get ahead of them. So hopefully that never happens, but it can happen, and it can happen from vendors or a very mad member of the public. Okay, electronic communications. Restrictions on electronic communication. Board members cannot discuss board business through private means like emails or texts. We'll talk a little bit more about what you can talk about, but if it's about the ELC or the work of the ELC, even if it's not coming before you for a vote, you cannot discuss it. You can't discuss it at all, but you can't discuss it on text or email. This prevents discussions and decisions to occur outside the public eye, which again is the whole point of Sunshine. It's very important that you not use reply all in board related emails. I tend to tell staff either email board members individually or BCC the board so they can't email each other, because a lot of times people are on their phones and they don't pay attention, and they just hit reply all instead of reply. So that's just best practice. And you cannot email other board members. All right, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about informal gatherings and social events. Again, Florida knows that many places are small and many communities are small. And a lot of times board members, particularly for ELC boards, are on other things together, right? Like maybe you're on a PTA together, or your kid's soccer league, or you work at the same agency. So they understand that, and there are some reasonable rules around that. You can attend a social gathering if public business is not discussed. The issue is if you discuss board business, even informally. The discussions at those private events, whether you think they will or not, they can influence your decisions, and they are prohibited under the law. Now, the topics that are safe that I tell you people to stick to: your family, the weather, travel, recipes. There you go. You don't want to talk about, there's this new VPK that's opening in my neighborhood. There's this private provider that I have a friend who got a job at. My kid goes to this VPK and we fund them and their nightmare, whatever it is. If it has anything to do with the work of the ELC, even if not coming before board action, you cannot discuss it. So stick to the safe topics: vacations, family, weather, unless you're talking about family stuff with VPK kids and you've got feelings about that. Recipes, that's a good one. Vacations, that's a nice one to talk about. You cannot, it happens all the time. It happens in front of the lawyers all the time. And I have to be like, no, stop. You cannot talk about this. You cannot. It's just human nature. So stick to the safe topics. Non-members as liaison. This is a big one. It happens a ton in Florida, and the people who will get punished will be you, not the people you use as the go-betweens. You cannot use a non-member of the board as a liaison. You cannot tell your spouse or your neighbor or your friend to tell another board member something. If you cannot talk to that board member about that person, you cannot use a non-member as a liaison, and you would be the one subject to the penalty. So be careful about that. That is an area that's real. It's a slippery slope, and it's hard to resist because it is frustrating. I'm going to be honest, to do business in the Sunshine. It is frustrating. It's frustrating for us. We have items that we want people to make decisions about, and we have to wait for a meeting so they can talk about it. It's maddening, but it allows it complies with the law, and it's the spirit of Florida and Florida Sunshine Law. All right, let's keep going to voting and abstention. So every member of a board must vote unless there's a conflict of interest and it's disclosed. This rule really is to make sure you vote and you don't have a conflict and you're sneaky about it and you don't say anything, because again, your conflicts need to be made known and they need to be in the public light. If you fail to vote, it does not invalidate the meeting. Full disclosure is required for conflicts. You have to disclose those conflicts, and abstention should be used only in those cases. Let's say, for example, you don't vote. You do what I said not to do. You go to the bathroom because you don't want to disclose your conflict. 2 months later, someone finds out, hey, they had a conflict. They didn't disclose it. It does not invalidate that vote, but it's not great. It can present problems that we would have to deal with, and the Florida Commission on Ethics can get involved. So best just to not do it. All right, let's keep going. Violations and consequences. There are civil and criminal penalties that can apply. You can be removed from office, and attorney's fees may apply. That's a big one. I mean, if they decide to prosecute you and you have to pay attorney's fees, that can be serious. Violations can render action voids unless they're appropriately cured. There is almost always, not always, but almost always a way to cure a violation, either a sunshine violation, a public records violation. You typically have to just fix it, explain that you broke the rule and that you're fixing it, and have it happen in sunshine. So say, for example, this is a common, not super common, but this has happened. You have a public meeting and you didn't appropriately notice it. You noticed it 4 hours in advance and it wasn't an emergency, and you vote and you take final action. We should cure that at a meeting that's properly noticed soon thereafter, where you have the same discussion, you talk about the same topic, and another vote is held. Notice is often one that we would cure later. Or public records disclosure. Let's say, for example, there's a public records request. You don't disclose something. You then find it later, or you realize you should have disclosed it. You can disclose it after the fact and explain that, you know, what actually happened. You didn't realize you should. You didn't know it existed. You couldn't find it. Most things can be cured, but it's important to get ahead of them. And that's when you talk to staff and the lawyer. Those are some penalties that can occur: non-criminal, second-degree misdemeanors, and possible fines up to $500. All right, let's keep going. So we talked about a little bit about curing violations. There is a cure process. A violation can be corrected with a new meeting that follows sunshine and allows for public comment. You can't just ratify what you did. So say, for example, I said the thing about no notice. There was 4 hours notice. You have the new meeting. You can't just immediately call for a vote. You have to redo the whole thing. Like staff would have to say, this is a discussion item about this topic. And then you have to have the discussion, and someone has to make a motion and a second and have public comment. Whatever your normal process is, you have to do again. You can't just say, all right, motion second, good. We've ratified what we did at the last meeting. That does not cure. Again, it has to have transparency in a public hearing to validate it. All right, let's keep going. This is our last topic, Florida Public Records. This is governed under Chapter 119. There's a few other statutes that are on point, but this is largely where it's at. 119 applies to public records. Now, we're going to talk a lot about drafts in a minute, but public records are documents, papers, letters, maps, books, tapes, photographs. Photographs, that's important. So if you take a picture on your phone of a private provider site or of a board meeting, public record. Films, sound recordings, data processing software, or other material, so like records that are in QuickBooks, regardless of the physical form, the characteristics, or means of transmission. All right, so let's keep going, as long as it has to do with the official business of this agency. Notes are non-final drafts. I don't know why, but people in Florida, by and large, do not believe that their drafts are public record, and they very much are. So if you have a draft document, I'm going to give you a good example. This is a true example. One of my cities, we have a problem with a developer. We're trying to work out an agreement. I'm drafting this document. It's a complicated document to try to work out this agreement. I mark it draft and I send it to the board members to review. I know it's a public record. So I made sure before it went out, it was in pretty close to final form, because if someone requests it, it's a public record. I didn't want to wait to finalize it, and because they needed it and they were chomping at the bit. But just because I marked it draft, just because it came from a lawyer, it is a public record. So there's no exception for that. Your personal notes on your agenda that you take at home, public record. Your notes you take on your phone during a meeting in your notes app, public record. There's no unfinished business exception to the public inspection and copying requirements. If the purpose of a document is in connection with the official business of the agency, again, not necessarily a vote, but the business of the agency, and the point of it is to communicate, perpetuate, or formalize the knowledge, it's a public record, even if it's not in final form. Let's keep going. So this talks about agencies that are subject to public records law. The short answer is you, board members, staff, subject to public records law. Let's keep going. Computer records and email. So information that's stored in a public computer is the same as if it's written on a page or printed in a document that's in a file cabinet. Email messages are public records. They're subject to disclosure in the absence of statutory exemption from public inspection. So we're going to talk briefly about this. There are some limited exemptions. Here are some things that could be exempt. Personal information, social security numbers, credit card numbers, address and phone numbers, if the person whose address and phone number it is protected. So there's actually quite a bit of protection and a pretty wide range under Florida statute. So it's law enforcement. I mean, this is not exhaustive, but like law enforcement, spouses of law enforcement, former law enforcement, spouses of former law enforcement, military spouses, judges, their spouses, their kids. There's a whole range. People that are guardian ad litem. That's actually for board members. You might be a guardian ad litem as a volunteer in your community. A lot of ELC board members have done that. Your personal information, your address, your phone number is confidential. You have to raise it. You have to ensure the agency knows that and protects it. But that is a common confidentiality area that people don't realize. The other thing is sometimes if there's active litigation, it can be exempt, but once the litigation is concluded, it becomes public record. So if it's subject, if we're having a discussion about a lawsuit and we're trying to settle a lawsuit and there's emails or texts about it, it's not public until the case is over, and then it's public. There is an exception to this. And this always makes people feel better, particularly staff. Just because you use a government computer or tablet or phone, that does not automatically make what you do a public record if it's personal. So say, for example, and this is super common, you have a work phone or work email on your phone, on your personal phone. And obviously it's government email and they pay for it. And you accidentally send an email from your work email. And it's to your spouse and you say, hey, I'm picking up the kids from soccer. Not a public record. That's private. You on your work phone send a text. What do you guys want for lunch? Not a public record, even though it was on your work phone. Always better to keep a firewall, but if it happens, it's not the end of the world. You take a picture of your kid on your work phone by mistake, or not even by mistake, because you left your regular phone at home and you're rushing and you're late. That picture does not become a public record. That's private, even though you used your work phone. Even though you did it intentionally, that's okay. You have to obviously protect it at that point, but you are okay. You're not going to get a lawsuit for a public records violation, or you might get one, but they won't win. You'll win. All right, let's talk about transitory messages. Let's go to this next slide. So transitory messages are something that they have short-term value. They're based upon the content or purpose of the message, not the format that's used to transmit it. Good examples are reminders, event notices, calendar appointments. They are not intended to formalize or perpetuate knowledge. They do not set policy, establish guidelines, confirm a transaction, or act as a receipt. They are public records until they are obsolete, superseded, or their administrative value is lost. A perfect example is a calendar invite or a flyer for an event. Once the event is over, you do not have to retain it. The event has occurred, the meeting has occurred, The calendar invite was not to perpetuate any sort of knowledge. There was obviously also, public notice posted somewhere. It does not need to be retained. Voice messages, voicemails, same thing. If they are transitory, if they are, hey, I'm on my way, and then they arrive, you do not have to retain. If they're, hey, we have a meeting next week, just want to remind everybody, you do not have to retain once the meeting occurs. All right, let's go to the next one. Who responds to public records requests? So every agency will have a custodian of their public records, and they're the ones responsible for responding to public records requests. But here is the caveat for board members and staff. If you create a public record and you do not transmit it to the custodian of public records, you then are the custodian. So here's how this would happen. You go to a board meeting. You have an agenda. You've marked on that agenda. You've written things. You've written words. You've highlighted and said, this is good. I'm going to vote for this, whatever it is on your agenda. And you leave the meeting. You take that with you. You now are the custodian of that public record. So best practice, if you have created a document that is subject to public records, just give it to staff before you leave the meeting and let them retain it, and they'll retain it under their records retention policy. Don't take it home with you. I mean, if you really need it for some point, you could make a copy of it. I will say this, the cleanest moves that board members make are if they do something like they post on Facebook and they're saying, I'm a board member of the ELC and we're having a backpack giveaway and I just want to let everybody know. You've created a public record. Screenshot that, send it to the staff and let them return it for you. There's a discussion that's occurring online on Facebook, and there's a news article that comes out that says this private provider is terrible. We're going to investigate them. DCF is there. You are a board member and you post, and you aren't posting as a parent or a person. You're posting as a board member. You're saying, I know that this agency is great. They've come before our board. They're wonderful. They will be vindicated. You now have created a public record, and you, the creator, are the custodian of that record. Screenshot it and send it to the staff. Try not to do stuff like that because you are creating public records left, right, and center, and you don't realize you're doing it. And if there's a request later, it can be complicated for you. Same thing with notes on your phone, on your notes app. Same thing with photos you take. Just send them to staff. That's the best practice. Then they will retain them as they have to do, and then then that shifts the burden to them as public records custodian. This happens more than people realize. Yeah.
Yep. We had a question. If a board member shares a Facebook post, one of our Facebook posts on their Facebook, do they need, I mean, we can see shares, so we know who shares our stuff. They don't need to do anything more, do they? Because they're not creating anything new. It's something that we would have within our public records.
That's fine. It's when they post comments that's always problematic.
Okay.
That's fine. And also, if it's transitory message, once the event happens, we're good. I see it most often in communities that have an active Facebook presence where people are like keyboard warriors and they are mad and they are posting left, right, and center, and they're creating all these public records and they're not recording it. Now, here's how you could get in trouble. You're mad. You post on Facebook. You don't record it. You don't keep a record of it. But you know who does? The public. And 3 months go by and they're pissed, or that private provider, and they're pissed and they're going to sue when they do a public records request. And we, the ELC, we produce our records. And then they sue us and they say, we know you have another record because we found it. We have it. And you didn't produce us to us. And that's a violation. Public records lawsuits suck for many reasons, but one of them is because it shifts fees. So if they win, we, the agency, have to pay their fees. Or technically, if they win against you as a custodian of public records, you could have to pay their fees. So the best practice is don't make any public records. Be mindful of it. I will say this. I tell clients, you can text me all you want, but your text should say, call me. Please call me. I'm available in an hour. Please call me. Do not send me a long text. Don't say, I have a question about this issue. Just wait for the phone. Because you're going to create a public record and then people will have questions about it. And if there's a lawsuit, they'll get to ask you questions under oath. So public records lawsuits, I don't know that they happen a ton in your county. I think it's hit or miss. It really depends how active people get, or if you get a really active citizen. But some communities, some smaller communities, will have one or two people that they just file public records lawsuits left, right, and center because they just have time on their hands and they're mad and they think there's sneakiness happening at the government. All right, who's authorized to inspect public records? So the short answer is anyone, everyone. We'll go to this next slide. You do not have to be a citizen. Yeah.
This is Matt McLean. On the public records, there's no allowance for board members taking personal notes. I was always under the impression that as long as that note wasn't shared with another board member, that you could make a personal note that would not be subject to public records. Is that not the case?
Not the case. It's a public record. Now, if your note says buy milk, not a public record. If the note says good policy, like this vendor, 2 thumbs up on this proposal, public record. So if it's about the business of the agency, even if they're your personal notes, even if they're in a draft format, public record. And again, the risk is that someone knows you have it. So, I mean, you know, you could go get a public records request, and obviously the right thing to do is to disclose it and provide them. The risk is someone sees you. And if your meetings are televised or video recorded, they will go back and look at the video and they'll say, I saw you make a note. I have one city where the citizens are insane. They are nuts about public records requests. They will watch the meeting and they will say, I saw this commissioner make this note at this time in the meeting, and I want that note. You guys have that's not your situation, but just be mindful of that. But yeah, a public record, unless it's personal, and then it's fine.
So Gemma, even now in this meeting, like I'm writing some notes about some of the things that you're saying that are not, you know, that are in addition to what's on the PowerPoint. By the way, everyone will share out the PowerPoint for everyone. Is that public record? Just my sort of thoughts on what you're saying?
Yep. I'll say this. Okay, so I'm a lawyer. When I go to meetings, any notes I take, public record, unless they're about litigation, and it has to be active litigation or threatened litigation. So when I am super careful when I'm in a meeting not to say things, and it's hard when you're in a meeting to not make notes. You can make notes, and again, it's fine as long as you are okay with someone seeing them. So the notes you're taking are perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. Just be careful that you don't say anything like this lawyer's stupid and an idiot. I mean, you can say that, I don't care. But the moral of the story is you want to make sure that whatever you write, you don't care if it gets splashed all over social media or the newspaper. But yeah, all public record. People don't realize that. People think that, I don't know why, but people, every single person thinks that. I don't know what it is. Maybe I don't know. That's a good question. I really genuinely don't know. But your community doesn't seem to have these issues, but other places do. So we just have to pray that none of those people move to your cities. Okay, so who can request them? Anyone. They don't have to be a citizen. They don't have to give you their name. They can be a child. Any human person. They do not have to have a need. They do not have to have a purpose. They do not have to tell you why they want it. Again, the sunshine is hard. It makes it hard sometimes, but it's the government we have elected to live under. All right, let's keep going.
We have a company who, just for board knowledge, we have a company that has been, how many times asked us for records?
About monthly.
Yeah, so, and they've been asking other ELCs for records as well. And, we can't ask them why. We can't, do anything but answer the request. The one thing we can do is we can charge them a reasonable amount of administrative costs. And, did they want to pay? Have they paid us?
Yeah, they just paid us.
Okay, yeah, because we had really been putting time into it, and finally by about the 5th or 6th request, we were like, you gotta pay us. So, we thought that would kind of stop the request, but they're paying us, so we're giving them, and we're reasonably sure this is, to further their business when we looked into what their business is, but we can't be sure because we can't ask. And, anyway, if they do ask us, asked to be a vendor, we would really consider whether or not we'd want to do business with this kind of place. But anyway, that's what's going on.
Yeah, so I mean, again, if it takes more than 30 minutes of staff time, there's not a law, but general rule of thumb, you do have to charge the rate of the lowest paid person who can actually pull it. And then if it's going to be more than 10 pages, you can charge copying unless it's electronic. I will tell you, some records do require redaction. And so what you can do is you can say, all right, well, to prepare the records, it's going to be $28 an hour, 7 hours. But then our lawyer, who's $250 an hour, has to review it. And that's going to be another 2.5 hours. So it's always best practice to have a policy that you apply universally. So if 30 minutes is your number, 30 minutes is your number. Typically, lawyers don't have to review unless it's going to, and I think I know who you're talking about. One of my agencies has that same public records request, and for whatever reason, they classify some employees. And so it's basically, we were able to say, I have to review all those records to ensure that there's no confidential information from employees. And the quote was like $1,200 and they didn't pay it. But you shouldn't do that on purpose. That was like their legitimate practice. So the moral of the story is it happens. You are allowed to do that though. But I will say this, and we're going to go here. Let's go to the next slide. So you do have to reply. The key, though, is that you have to promptly acknowledge the request and respond in good faith. There is not a statutory time you have to reply. You have to make reasonable efforts to do so. There is case law which shows that between 4 and 9 months is not unreasonable, depending on the volume of the request, the work of the agency. It is not your job as an agency to respond to PRRs. You have to do it. You have to respond to public records requests, but that's not your core function. So it's not unreasonable to make people wait. And I come into cities and they'll say, the public will scream, I submitted my public records request 2 weeks ago and I don't have it yet. And I'll say, well, I mean, legally we have 4 months. We could go up to 9 months because we're very busy and we're working on it. And you asked for something and it's 3,000 pages. So we're doing our best. People don't like it, but that's the reality. So you do have a little latitude on how long you can respond. And some ELCs get real nervous and they want to respond in like 48 hours. And I'm like, you don't need to do that. Just relax, do it right. Take your time, do a cost estimate, get the deposit or get the money up front, and then reply. It's okay. This is not your core function as an agency. All right, let's keep going. There are some exemptions. The ones I outlined usually are the ones about personnel, personal information, address, phone number, social, credit card information, but there's others. The public records law is liberally construed in favor of open government. In Florida, again, we love open government. We love government and sunshine. The exemptions are narrowly construed. And the burden is on the agency to illustrate why a record falls within the statutory exemption. So the example I just gave you about how employees were classified as vendors, it was easy for us to say, we have to go through and redact these 1,000 records because our 300 employees, whatever it is, are classified as vendors and they are protected under XYZ statutes. And so we have to go through and redact. So, but we did have, the burden shifts to us to explain why the cost was going to be so high for the redactions. All right, so let's go to the last slide and then we can talk if there's any other questions. So, and I'm trying to stay close to my 1 hour estimate to respect your time as a board. You guys are doing good, important work. So appreciate you being here. So again, just to go over, Sunshine Law ensures transparency in government. The goals and the requirements are public access, meeting notices, record keeping, and public participation. Violations are serious, but can almost always be corrected. Always, if you think there's a violation, come to the staff and have them reach out to me right away so we can fix it. The Florida Code of Ethics governs the conduct. Public records law mandates open access to all forms of public records, including electronic. So that's the summary. You can take this down if you want. And then if you all have any questions, I'm happy to help. So